Very good. Well, Mark, here we are again for a very special edition of Uplink. I suppose, we have talked to extreme environments medics. We have talked to cosmologists, but never has there been, I think, a greater collision of worlds than what we're about to do in just a few minutes' time. Welcome back. Nice to see you again. It's looking a little chilly where you are. Um, uh,
Yeah.
and I wonder if you could give us a little run through who we're having on the show today.
So, yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a kind of a special confluence meeting of interesting minds this afternoon. People that have been linked to space rocks. And in fact, all three of the people we have on this afternoon were at the ESTEC Open Day 18 months ago. So in a sense, it's a bit of a reprise of that. So I'm just going to start with the ESA person first, because that's who I work for. So Thomas Reiter, ESA astronaut, very experienced astronaut, several flights, long time on the space station, and has ridden the shuttle and Soyuz. And he later on became our director for human spaceflight and operations, and he's now an advisor to the director general. So I've known Thomas quite a while, and I also know that he's a big fan of music. And in fact, hopefully you'll talk about it this afternoon. In fact, he played guitar on the space station even before Chris Hadfield did. Thomas is quite proud of that. But he's a fan of progressive rock, and one of the bands that he likes very much is a band that I've known for a long time, and that's Marillion. And Marillion, of course, have been around since the early 80s. In fact, I first saw them play 82 or so when I was a student. And so today we have the guitarist, Steve Rothery, who has a great love for space and astronomy and exploration, and is, as we'll hear this afternoon, is writing music around that theme at the moment, solo work. And then the two of them are joined in a sort of very totally fascinating way by, and it's always remarkable to me, that the third person is Rick Armstrong. And Rick, of course, is the son of Neil Armstrong, first human to set foot on the moon in 1969. So sort of Rick connects the human spaceflight side that comes from Thomas, but Rick's a great progressive rock fan as well. And in fact, is in a prog band with the bass player, Pete Travis, from Marillion. So, everything's kind of hooked up together. And I know that Thomas has actually even been on stage with Marillion, sound checking with them, and felt that was a privilege to be able to play guitar with them. But yeah, everybody, they're all very closely linked to space and to music. And isn't that what Space Rocks is all about?
Indeed, indeed. Well, I mean, there's a deep history between actual played music, and of course, in space exploration, but also, we've talked about frequently a deep philosophical connection as well. Something that's cultural and scientific, and the two notions seem very conjoined. And I guess that really is the essence of what we're all trying to talk about today. And I couldn't imagine two better guests to invite on. So without further ado, we're going to bring Rick and Steve aboard. So let's take 1 second. We've got Steve Rothery. How you doing? Are you receiving?
I am receiving.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Good to see you, Steve.
Indeed. Hey. It's looking very, very zero G where you are, and now we're joined by Rick as well. Rick, how are you doing, man? Are you receiving us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. I can indeed. Well, what a pleasure to have you both here, and to see you again. It feels like yesterday we'd all taken the stage at the open day at ESTEC to, I guess, broach a subject that is kaleidoscopic, because there are so many answers from so many different people. This deep interconnection that exists between space exploration, creativity, artistry, and indeed music. So Steve, you've got an album coming up later this year. But the thing is I sense that your connection with space, your fascination with it, goes back far further than simply your work on Revontulet.
Oh, absolutely. It's just one of those fascinations I had from quite a young age. I was a huge science fiction fan. I suppose I'm a Trekkie. And then, kind of as I started getting into music, some of my favorite music was actually film soundtracks. And even now, probably some of my favorite all-time music is a soundtrack to Blade Runner, which I think is about as close to perfection as you could get. So yeah, it's always held that fascination for me. I think, you know, I grew up in a small fishing town in North Yorkshire called Whitby. And I remember we used to kind of go out into the moors in the middle of the night and look up at the stars. And it was nowhere near as impressive as the deserts of Chile, but it was still quite an amazing sight, you know, away from all the light pollution that you tend to get everywhere these days.
Well, I mean,
so I'm interested. You know, you hold that. How many other members of the band? You know, has that informed at any time during Marillion's history? Kind of, you know, a songwriting direction. I mean, I've got pretty much all your albums, and I wouldn't say
Right.
you know, it's not a direct strand, but it must be there in the background.
No.
I think.
I mean, Steve quotes the Hubble actually in the perfect mirror floating in space in When I Meet God. That's probably the most direct reference I can think of. But it's always been an influence with me, you know, my musical tastes, everything from Pink Floyd through to Vangelis, and there was an album actually when I was growing up by a guy called John Keating called Space Experience, which had like various sort of like, you know, space images on the cover, but it was like classic tunes of the time, but done in a very sort of sci-fi way. This is like in the birth of synthesizers, really, where a mini Moog was an exotic thing. So it's always had that kind of fascination with me, really. That the idea of trying to create something otherworldly in musical terms, the same way that you would, you know, this feeling that you would get looking up in the heavens.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about that. You know, I mean, we've discussed this in previous uplinks and all sorts of engagements about how space provokes an intellectual response, a curiosity, but also a desire to express its beauty, you know, its wonder, its vastness. Sometimes its emptiness. You know, it conjures so many different emotions. Is that a statement you can relate with?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think also it gives you a sense of perspective of the troubles of the world. Yeah, and it's quite humbling, I think. And it's an eternal beauty that has, I think, inspired man through the ages.
Yeah, it certainly has. It certainly has. And well, I guess speaking of which, you know, I have to say, Rick, I think we can probably guess at perhaps your earliest exposure to the concept of space exploration. Certainly, I mean, and that's certainly what's brought us together. But also that you've grown up and you've formed a band as well, which is a tremendous thing. I mean, was your life as a child just fully immersed in space exploration, being exposed, just given your father's adventures?
Well, you know, really just seemed it was normal to us. And I think if you talk to any of the astronaut kids, they will sort of same thing, is that it didn't seem to be, you know, anything outside of the normal. I think, you know, later in life, I've heard from people who, you know, we didn't have a sense that people were following it as closely as they were, right? And I think that's probably due to the parents tried to keep the kids, you know, grounded, for lack of a better term. And I think actually, you know, as I've gotten older, I realized that part of that was, or maybe a lot of it was just downplaying the risk. You know, so that the kids didn't really worry about the danger of dads going into space, and we didn't actually. We just always thought everything would work.
Indeed. Well, I mean, it's an extraordinary environment to grow up, but I guess it's just so counterintuitive to think that, yeah, perhaps you thought this is just your dad going to work. And
it's a hard thing. That's exactly it. It's a hard thing to explain. I think it's a hard thing to convey. But you know, I've done a few sort of presentations with other astronauts kids, where, you know, we did a Q&A or whatever, And I just remember thinking, someone would ask somebody else a question, and I'd hear their answer, and I'm like, yes, that's exactly how I would have answered it. You know, and that happened again and again and again. So we really just all thought that this was normal life. You don't know any different, and so you just treat it normally.
So I'm intrigued then where music fit into all, because of course famously some of the astronauts came back and were very artistically inspired to try to portray that emptiness, that insignificance, you know, which frankly, I mean, you said it before, Steve, right? Anybody who considers space for more than 5 minutes and thinks that human beings are actually significant really needs an attitude adjustment, right? I mean, it's such a leveler once you start considering it. But was there music in your family when you were younger, Rick? Was that something? Because of course I know that some of your siblings, you know, musical as well.
Yeah, there was. I mean, my dad, you know, he played the piano. I never really ever saw him practice, but he could just sit down and play like someone who was obviously had done this before, right? You know,
how annoying is that, right? He didn't even see him practice, and he could do it, right?
Never saw him practice. I don't know how he did it actually. And he played the baritone horn. He played it in band in high school. He was involved in musicals in college, and so yeah, he always had a music background. I think similar to Steve, the thing, and I listened to music when I was a kid, and I had piano lessons and that stuff, but the thing that really got me was the synthesizer. Starting to hear tracks. I mean, Elton John was probably the first one I remember sort of really being intrigued by the synthesizer. And then I found brain salad surgery. And that was kind of it for me. That's what got me into progressive rock music, and it all exploded from there. So,
indeed. So how did you and Steve cross paths for the first time? I mean, it sounds like that's the you know, prog music was almost like the magnetic field that pulled you together. So how did you initially cross paths?
I was I mean, Marillion was, you know, sort of quickly became my favorite band. I had bought Misplaced Childhood without having heard it, sort of back in the days when you went to the record store and actually browsed through things and, you know, tried to find things that were interesting. And I bought that album without ever hearing it and just loved it immediately, which is hardly ever happens. And just that was my entree into it. The first time I saw them in concert was the Season's End tour in Cincinnati, but it wasn't until you know, it never would had occurred to me to go back stage and try to meet anyone or talk to anybody, because I just didn't know that happened, right? But on the Afraid of Sunlight tour, I had left. I was going out of the venue after the gig. This was in Columbus, and going through the parking lot, and all these people were standing around. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? He says, yeah, someone said the, you know, band might come out. I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I should hang around a bit. And Steve came out, and H came out, and I think I saw Pete. So I just went up and said hello to Steve and said, you know, you've been my one of two main inspirations in playing guitar, and just wanted to thank him for that. And it just kind of went from there, you know. That was about 25 years ago.
Wow. Well, I mean, so
answer than you wanted.
A long time ago.
I'm going to jump back in just briefly for just two things to give my first Marillion experience, but also to excuse myself. I've got builders right next door who have just decided to use a staple gun to erect a fence about 2 meters from my head. So I might be just smiling a lot during today, but since they've stopped for the time being, first time I saw Marillion, I was a student in Edinburgh, and it was in the basement of one of the student unions. And I've always told the story, which I'm sure is apocryphal, that there were more people in the band than there were in the audience on that day. It was very early on, about 81, 82 maybe. And I just remember being utterly terrified by Fish, who, you know, is just up here somewhere, just leering down with, what was it now? Yeah. Well, maybe it was Grendel. I can't remember now, but it just scared the living daylights out of me. I mean, at least, you know, you've calmed down on the terrifying the kids of the world part since then. But
yes, most definitely. Yeah, that was definitely one of Fisher's favorite pastimes in Grendel, to lift up somebody from the front row of the audience and do the kind of ripping out their throat thing. So yes, lots of soiled underwear, I think, from the young fans. But yeah, no, with Rick, I mean, we just kind of clicked really very early on, and you know, over the years, you know, the Marillion weekends, you know, Rick's become like a part of our family. And I had the great honor and pleasure of going to see one of the last shuttle launches with Rick, which was just a phenomenal experience. Really, just the sheer violence and bravery of those people in this basically rocket, you know, a solid fuel propellant, no off button, no escape, punching a hole in the sky thing. It was a phenomenal experience.
It's something that, you know, to my discredit, I've never actually been able to witness. I mean, I can only imagine how visceral the sound must be. You know, maybe something like my experience of watching motorsport in person. You know, it creates that same kind of thrill, but on a level that's absolutely, you know, beyond words. But I wonder if witnessing something like that is more than simply visceral for Rick. You know, obviously having once, you know, watched his dad, you know, go up in the same way. Did that tap into something deep with you, Rick?
You know, I'd like to say yes, but I can't swear that it did. The experience, you know, you know, I saw 2 Saturn V launches, and those and total eclipses are the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life, and particularly the Apollo 17 night launch was probably the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So it was like a reverse eclipse, right? It was like dark, and then all of a sudden it was daytime at you know, 12:30 at night, and the thing that you can't replicate is the feeling that you get in your body for a Saturn V launch. It just shakes your insides, and nothing else that I'm aware of can do that. The shuttle sounds similar, but because it goes off the pad so much quicker, it doesn't have that time to just pound the ground with the you know, with the exhaust in the same way that a Saturn V did. So yeah, it's it just kind of you know, that overwhelms your moment. You know, I don't know that you have a chance to think about anything else because it just dominates.
Yeah,
I was taken away. Alex, you said, you know, you got halfway through the sentence, you felt it was like seeing motor, and I thought you were going to say head, but rather than motorsport. And I suspect a Motorhead gig in the old day, you know, that could have been pretty close. But.
No, I've been to Formula One, and Motorhead was louder. I can tell you that much. Yeah, quite a thing. Well, you know, it's actually a really good moment for us to talk with another person who has a completely well, I'd say an extraordinarily rare perspective, who has obviously experienced launch from a top rocket. Thomas Reiter, the astronaut, is about to join us in a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about his experience of, I guess, launching up into the great beyond. So he's just coming aboard with us. And this is, I guess, in some sense, a bit like a family reunion for all of us, simply because we've all certainly met before, and we've got there we go. Thomas, you are live. Are you receiving? Oop. We'll see. I think it might just take a moment for his microphone to come on. While he's doing that, Mark, do you want to give us a little bit of background on your first encounter with Thomas?
I'm not sure I could tell you the first time. I mean, Thomas was an astronaut before I arrived at ESA, but then was a director for human spaceflight and operations. And and anecdotally, one of the best moments that I do remember very clearly with Thomas was the launch of Gaia. So Gaia is our mission which observes a couple of billion stars in the Milky Way to measure their positions. And it was launched in 2013 on a Soyuz rocket. And I wasn't at the launch in French Guiana, but I was in European Space Operations Center in Darmstadt, where Thomas was the director. And so I was there representing science, and Thomas was representing operations. And we were sitting in the front row. We'd both given a speech, and then the rocket goes up, and you're watching on the screen, and it's all very, exciting. And then at some point, Thomas leant over and nudged me and said, "Oh, this bit's particularly tough." And I'm thinking, oh, shit, he actually has been through that bit personally on top of the rocket. So it was from very personal experience, not just sort of watching from a distance. But yeah, I always have the greatest admiration for anybody who's willing to strap themselves to one of those things. But anyway, Thomas, good
Indeed.
to see you.
Thomas, I believe you are now live. Are you receiving?
Reading loud and clear. That was a little challenge in the afternoon to get this connected. Sorry for the delay.
All good, all good. It's a delight to have you on, and of course, an absolute pleasure to see you once again. I mean, there is so much to talk about, and we're just so pleased to have you aboard. I suppose from the perspective of an astronaut, a few technical difficulties isn't unheard of, certainly, but how you deal with them certainly is.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a remarkable experience. Weightlessness, the view that you have on our beautiful planet, and also when you're looking in the opposite direction towards the infinity of space on the night side. And in this situation, if you can actually, in your spare time, which is not a lot when you are up there, just before going to bed or on the weekends, there's a little bit more time. If you then can listen to your favorite music, it's just remarkable.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Well,
we have to put you on the spot, of course, there, Thomas, and say, I mean, we've worked with many of the astronauts over the years, of course, to provide playlists, which in essence are a little bit of PR to some extent, but you must have had favorites. And of course, you're not allowed to name Marillion at this point. That would just be too much. But
yeah, you know what? I actually pulled out one of the mini discs that I was using on the Mir station on my first mission. In those days, it was not possible to take all the music on a hard disk with you. So we really made a computation of volume for normal tapes or whatever media was available, mass, and the time that you can store music. And the best medium was actually these mini discs. So this is one of the mini discs I had on the Mir station, and you see here actually the board stamp that I stamped when I was on the station. And this is one rock and heavy metal, and I'll just tell you a few of them. So, for example, Van Halen, Ain't Talking About Love.
Great track.
ZZ Top, Legs. Let's Work Together is from, it's blues. I don't remember what the band was, but those are some of those favorites. And there is a funny experience I had. One of my favorite mini discs with Pink Floyd music on it slowly floated away. Everything which you don't fix under rubber bands, you just leave it for a moment. You think it stays there, but there is always some residual moment. You turn around and it's gone. And this thing was gone for 6 weeks. And after 6 weeks, we found it in the grid of one of these ventilators. Every weekend we have to do housekeeping, as sometimes we have to do on Earth. So we clean the filters, and this little mini disc has made its way to the intestines of the station, of the Mir station, behind the panels. Somehow, there are cables and tubes and all kind of life support systems and other systems. It made its way through, and it was actually hanging in one of those filters. And I was very relaxed. It happened at the very beginning of the mission, so it would have been really a loss.
See, this is amazing, okay? Because, I mean, you were literally just talking about like the inky blackness of space and that vista. And the first thing that comes to mind, is not Van Halen and ZZ Top, you know, in terms of the soundtrack to all of that. You know, it's got to be big. It's got to be Wagner or something. You know, so that is an incredible statement. I didn't know that Van Halen had actually been played in orbit, which is well, that's a revelation to me. How fantastic! I guess it's good music to work to.
Yeah, indeed. This is more for music, for the work time, but Alex, you're right. Of course, there are times when you rather would like to listen to a little bit more slow music. And just one thing I have in memory, which was just printed into memory because it was so remarkable. One of the nights before going to bed, and usually this was after midnight, there was a lot of things to do, and we only got then to go to bed after midnight. And I thought, well, before really getting into my sleeping bag, I just take a look out of the window, and it was on the night side of the orbit. And I was listening to a song from Fleetwood Mac, Albatross. You know, Albatross is this nice, slow blues type pace. And while I was watching, looking out of the window, I saw actually a meteorite entering into the atmosphere just below. It was overtaking the station. And as we were just flying over Europe, and it, you know, this is one of these lucky events where you look at the right spot in the right moment to see this little meteorite entering the atmosphere. I'm sure it was just a very small piece of rock which then evaporated, but it left a very beautiful trail. And with this music, it just printed into my memory.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing just to think that was happening and unfolding. But of course, there is another kind of music that was played you know, in orbit by yourselves. Tell us about the guitar. And probably the greatest summation of space rock there has ever been.
You know, I have to tell, I'm really bloody amateur. So it's not it's not that I play very well, but I like to do that as a kind of, you know, relaxation. And of course, I'm sure you have heard from Tim or any of my colleagues, it's pretty loud up there. So if you are playing an instrument, you first need to really find a place where you can hear what you are playing. And that is usually in the airlock. On the Mir station and also on ISS later in 2006, usually when I took the guitar, I went to the airlock because there this ventilation sound is not so loud, and you can actually hear what you are playing. And yeah, then I played the few tunes I know, and it's also a nice experience. You don't have to hold the weight of the guitar. Okay, it's not heavy anyhow, but the rest basically functions very well. So I mean, just playing the guitar doesn't need a readaptation. One of my French colleagues, Jean-Pierre Agnaret, he took a small saxophone with him, and he told me that actually due to the effects of weightlessness, you need to adapt the way how you generate the tone when you are playing saxophone. So it took him a couple of days until he actually could generate the tone as he was used to when he was on Earth.
So, I mean, this is mind-blowing, of course, because, you know, I always thought that pretty much every atom of matter that is taken up into space is accounted for, you know, but from the sounds of it, it sounds like people just they bring a lot of personal items along with them, a bit of Earth, a bit of themselves with them as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, nobody would be able to bring a piano to space. Not yet, who knows?
Maybe a guitar.
And I was lucky that the guitar was already on board, both on Mir station and on ISS. So the only thing I brought was a set of strings in case something, you know, a string breaks. Then I have some spares. But I think Jean-Pierre, he was able to to bring up this little saxophone. Probably it had to stay on board. So for the next colleagues to come on board the station, in case there would have been a saxophone player, he or she could have used it. Yeah.
It sounds like the potential for cruel and unusual punishment, though, right? If somebody decides they'd like to play the saxophone on board and has no idea, have somebody nearby who's been learning to play Happy Birthday on the trumpet for the last week, and they are no better than they are a week ago, and it's beginning to really. So yeah, you should definitely throw the saxophone overboard. That's. But I'm just intrigued because given who we have here, you know, Steve and Rick. Are there any key? You said there wouldn't be a piano on board, but a keyboard, a synthesizer of some kind. Yeah. That would be definitely, you know, of equivalent mass and volume.
Yes,
is there one on board?
On ISS, there was a small electronic keyboard on there, and actually, Mike Lopez Alegria, he joined me about halfway through the mission in fall 2006, and he was occasionally playing on this little. It was a small one, but yes, an electronic keyboard. Yeah.
I know Katie Coleman had a flute. She played, I think she played some kind of duet with Ian Anderson from the ISS, if I remember it. I might have that story wrong, but I know she had a flute up there.
Wow, wow, yes. Well, a flute is small enough. You can put it in this bag where you can put some personal items. That's small enough. That's true. Yeah, I can imagine that must have been also a very nice duet to play with Ian Anderson.
So I'm intrigued now, you know, going back to Rick and Steve. How do you, in your creative process as musicians, you know, if you're inspired by space, but you know, how do you find kind of the connection? We've often talked on Uplink about, you know, artist process and how they kind of channel things in a way. Is it sort of present, or is it a struggle, or is it, you know, how you've got those pictures behind you, right? Both of you've got kind of space pictures. When you've been writing your album, Steve, has that been something where you've been kind of embedding yourself in the subject and then channeling it, or is it just there already?
I think with this new album that I'm currently in the process of recording, the first track, Lucia, I released, and that was a piece of music I wrote to perform just before the solar eclipse there. So, you know, I looked at photos of the place. I'd been to Paranal, the other observatory, and Alma. So I tried to imagine the atmosphere of the place. And you try and encapsulate that almost in musical terms. It's like, you know, kind of writing a movie soundtrack, really, that the movie's maybe only in your head, but based upon those images and videos that you might have seen. So it's and then of course you get the footage and you're trying to create a movie around the music that you then wrote. So it kind of all evolves around. But yeah, I mean, that kind of imagery is so incredibly inspirational.
Is that a very different process to the band process for Marillion? I mean, of course, it's a solo album, so it's you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a musician. I just, you know, I know lots of bands at a distance, and of course, you know, some bands fight like crazy when they're writing music, and some get on famously well. I'm not looking for an expose. I'm just curious how the process might be different.
Well, with my album, some of it's written with my keyboard player, Ricardo Romano, from my solo band, who's a brilliant musician, and we have a great musical chemistry. With Marillion, you know, we've been working together now with Steve Hogarth over 30 years, and we're very fortunate is that we do still get on. You know, we don't want to kill each other, and there is a great, like, a musical shorthand that happens. You know, and it's an incredible thing to see, where you have something that's just a ghost of an idea, and then it's like bounced around between people, and it grows in this almost organic way. So, you know, within a few minutes, you have this incredibly beautiful piece of music that didn't exist up until that moment. So you know, it's quite rare, and we're quite lucky to have that sort of chemistry. Otherwise, it's usually one main writer and everyone else just plays their part. But it's never been like that with Marillion.
Well, I gotta ask though, please.
No, I was just going to say, Thomas is very humble. Thomas came along to one of the Marillion concerts and played my guitar at the sound check. I can tell you, he's a very fine musician himself.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was really a great experience for me. I've never had the chance to, play a few chords with such equipment on a real stage. I really.
Is there a recording of that? Did you? Somebody must have at least filmed it on a mobile phone or something.
I don't know. Maybe the German fan club. Some of the German fan club were there.
Got to see that. Yeah.
But I haven't seen it. It was great.
Sorry, Steve. I was going to jump over to Rick.
I mean, the space rocks thing we did the first time I met Thomas. There was you feel a connection really. I think the love of music, as well as all those experiences and the incredible accomplishments that Thomas has had. He's such a fantastic ambassador for ESA and for the human race. Really, so I just have to say that. But,
thank you very much. And
I was going to jump over to you, Rick, because of course you collaborate with Pete from Marillion in Edison's Children. Was that through Steve? Did you kind of meet up in you got to know the band and then that figured? Because I'm not sure I know the history fully, but there was kind of a collaboration, and now you're a full band member.
It wasn't through Steve. It was through so Edison's Children is primarily or originally Pete and a guy from the U.S., Eric Blackwood. And I had met Eric at the Montreal convention, 2011, I think. And he was doing some work for the band then, and that's, I think, how he met Pete originally and how their collaboration started earlier than 2011, but I don't remember the exact year. And he had said, that he was working on an album with Pete, and it was going to be out, in another year or so. I said, I'm really looking forward to hearing that. And that became an album called In the Last Waking Moments. Really enjoyed it. And then Edison's Children was trying to do, I think for the next, was it 2013? Marillion convention in Montreal. They got a chance to play at this sort of the official pub of the Marillion weekend called Utopia, and they were going to try to play a little gig there during the day, and I got asked to be on a few songs to sort of fill out the band, because to play these songs live requires more than just the two of them. And so that went well. And then in another year or so, there was sort of an opportunity to play some gigs in the US, but Pete wasn't going to be able to make that. And so Eric asked me if I wanted to try to, take over his parts. And I said, well, that would be cool. That I got to believe there's better people than me that you could find to do that. But he picked me anyway. I think I was salary cap friendly. I think might have been the best reason. So some of those gigs didn't actually happen, but we did play a couple. One in New York in a club, and then a house concert. And I mean, sort of eventually, I got asked to play a guitar solo on one song on the Somewhere Between Here and There album, and so that was 13 seconds of glory for me. That I'm on a record now. This is great. And then so my in the latest album that we released at the Servants Fields, and actually was a bigger participant. So now I sort of became a full band member. So, but just to I didn't start this band. I just joined it. But it's been great fun and a real pleasure to work. Pete is great to work with. I try to learn anything I can from him, and Eric as well. We have a big mutual love of baseball, so we get talking baseball just out of the blue for no reason. So anyway, does that answer your question, or is that?
Yeah. No, I was listening to a couple of days ago, and
I did have to learn one of Steve. One of the things I had to learn. Steve played a guitar solo on the first album that I had to learn. One of the songs that we were thinking of doing, but we never actually did it. So.
Also, when we played the concerts in Chile last July, Rick played bass on a great deal of the songs. So you had to learn all Pete's bass lines, didn't you, for a lot of episodes?
Yeah, that was a challenge because Pete, and I've heard him talk about his compositional styles, and he likes to say, I like to make little changes, don't want to play the same thing every time. And yeah, that's great for the music, but when you're trying to learn it, it definitely makes your job harder. So.
Well, I mean, speaking of South America, certainly, it's not just about Steve. The single that you've already released and the album that's coming out a little later this year, but you also had a pretty extraordinary video production experience as well. And I guess for many of us, perhaps one of the closest experiences we may ever have to being in outer space, from the sounds of it.
Yeah, I mean, the footage that we got down at La Silla was spectacular. The drone footage actually of the eclipse happening. There's only sort of 2/3 of it's been seen so far in the video, but the final version probably be finished for the crowdfunding launch at the end of September. But to see it in 4K, just the sense you get of the place, and just see the Milky Way overhead, it's an incredible experience, and to perform in those places there and on the platform in Paranal with the laser firing behind us. It was just kind of like, it doesn't get any better than this.
Were you, I've seen the video, were you actually playing through the eclipse through totality? I mean,
no.
Good. That's good, because that's kind of the last thing you want to do, right? Is be distracted by anything else.
No, we stopped about 10 minutes before it started.
Right.
Because obviously we wanted to watch it as well. It was a phenomenal experience, and so surreal to see the quality of the light change at that time of the day. Because it's not like twilight. It was still quite a blue light, but then it just kind of the way the totality. It was just mind blowing.
I'm interested. Who else has seen a total solar eclipse? I mean, I saw one in Hawaii in '91, I guess. But I mean, if you haven't,
I've seen a couple. The best one was in 1973 off the coast of Africa, which was 6 minutes almost, like one of the longest eclipse of the 20th century, I think. And then so that, along with the Saturn V launch I mentioned, it's just two experiences that when I think about are just you'll never forget them.
I mean, the one I saw, and I'm sure maybe you felt the same. It'd be interesting to hear your views. I mean, I'm an astronomer. Was on halfway up the Mauna Kea. The telescopes are on the top. It's a place I know very well. We had to drive until the last minute because there were clouds on the coast, and we were on the saddle road. So it was kind of a last minute panic thing. We were planned, but there were clouds rolling over. And then when it happened, any sense of being an astronomer or even a sentient animal of any kind just disappeared instantly. I mean, you could see why people felt it was terrifying in history. I mean, because it was then. I mean, in some kind of, there was a sense of connection with the universe in an utterly bizarre way. And the way that I always phrase it is that you never, ever see something black against the sky and the rest of the sky not being bright, but being a little bit illuminated. It's kind of the inverse of everything else, which is the moon is a bright thing, stars, the sun. That it looked like a hole in the sky, just a few hundred meters above my head. I mean, when I got that in my brain, I just couldn't let go of it. I just almost felt the air was escaping. And I was a PhD astronomer. I mean, it wasn't as if I was, just... But there were people sitting there in cars. I remember some other people had driven to the same place, same car park. And a couple of people refused to get out of the cars. They were literally cowering in the back. They did not want to watch this thing. They'd obviously been taken there by somebody else. So I'm curious, you were surrounded by other people. Did you kind of get a sense of that emotional connection? People not bonding exactly, but feeling something quite special.
I think it was very emotional. A lot of people crying actually with the emotion of the occasion. It was such a beautiful and I suppose in a way, yeah, you could understand why people would be terrified by it if they didn't understand what was happening. It's such a powerful experience. But yeah, I'm so glad that we got to experience it.
We were really lucky too, because the weather forecast for Chile had been really poor for the previous couple of weeks, and even the day before, I remember somebody saying, "Yeah, it looks like it's going to be, completely clouded over." You're just crossing your fingers, and when you get up on the day, it was like there was no clouds at all, and there were hardly saw a cloud the whole day, so it just couldn't have gone better. Yeah, it was great.
So, Steve, I got to ask you a really obvious question, but tell us about the title of the album. What's behind that, and what does it all mean?
Right. Well, I apologize to anybody Finnish out there, because I don't know the correct pronunciation, but I'd probably say it in a more French way, Revontulet, which is the Finnish name for the Aurora Borealis. It's a firefox. It's a Finnish beast fable about this fox whose tail sweeps the snow up into the sky, which causes the northern lights. And I thought that was just such an incredibly poetic image that I thought that would be a great title track for the album. And I can imagine something probably in 3 parts, some of which might be quite orchestral, some very electronic, and something quite acoustic. So that's my themes really to explore on that track.
It's a fantastic title for an album, certainly. And, having only once seen the Aurora Borealis, but having been completely blown away by it, I guess it's just one of those things tied so deeply to the human experience. I can't imagine how much mythology it's probably inspired until we actually certainly knew what it was. But I guess that's, again, a thing that we keep on touching on here is the deep interconnection between space exploration, science, and music. And certainly something that people might not always realize is, of course, I guess as Thomas is such a great example, we're not just sending pilots, engineers, scientists into orbit. We're sending human beings as well, who are responding emotionally to that thing. I mean, Thomas, when you came back, did you feel the experience had changed who you were? Did it change the way that you saw humans and the Earth?
Definitely. I mean, those impressions that you are collecting while you are on board a space station for such a long time are so, they are going so deep. They are buried in your memory. You will never forget them. That is clear. And when you return, of course, it's not that like every moment this is present, but there are over the time always cases where you think about these thoughts you had when you are cruising above the Earth and enjoying this view. And this especially is true when you are reading headlines, or in general you are provided news when you are on the space station, and of course you want to keep in touch what's going on. And reading these news articles from this perspective, I can assure you, gives a kind of different perspective. It's a different way you perceive it, and you judge on it. And that doesn't really change when you come back, because you always tend to see or read those things, or I mean, in the TV, the news you see, you always put them in the context with this view you had from high above the Earth. And that remains, at least for me. I have to say, when I now, just to give you an example, when you're flying over Southern America, you can see these deforestation with your bare eyes. You don't need to have a binocular to see it. You can see it with your bare eyes. And now every time I hear in the news or see it in the evening that this process is still ongoing, it's very worrying. Now, when you just hear about it and you have not seen it with your own eyes, it slightly seems to be far away. But of course, that has completely changed. And maybe another example, we are, I mean, I've been telling that this view is really exciting, and whenever you have a minute between your work and you pass by a window and you're looking out and you see beautiful views of deserts, for example. We know deserts are very friendly for humans or for anyone who is living down there, but from up there it looks incredibly beautiful, variety of colors, of textures. And I remember a moment when we were just cruising over the northern part of Africa, Mauritania. There is a big crater you can see. It's call it the Eye of Mauritania, and you are just enchanted by it. And then you are passing over the Mediterranean, and all of a sudden you see in a certain spot, you see plumes, smoke plumes coming up. Of course, you know at this moment that this is not just because of natural disaster, it's because of military interactions. So in that time, there was a conflict between Lebanon and Israel. And from one second where you were still so excited about the beauty, you are pulled back to the reality, to the harsh reality on Earth. So those are all these impressions that you know, you pick up when you are in space, and they follow you for the rest of your life.
So I'm intrigued to follow up on that with Rick, because of course, if we think back to Apollo, I mean, of course, Apollo had a very strongly political element, part of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. But you know, the rest of us, I mean, at least from where I'm sitting, right? I mean, you know, you and Alex are American, but everybody else, I think, shared in that moment, right? It was something for all of humankind. And that must have been something that was in the air, in the mind of people at the time. It wasn't just about, you know, planting a flag as such. Yes, that happened, but it was a bigger thing, that it was bringing the world together. So at the risk of sort of getting a little political, which, you know, here we are today, the world seems to be falling apart again. And do you see that as a disappointing thing? I mean, you know, space can bring people together, music can bring people together, but for all of this exploration and the overview effect that Thomas was talking about and so on, we seem not to be learning that lesson. And I'm sort of intrigued from your perspective, you know, how do you see that having changed over your lifetime? Because you were there at a key moment where, in essence, the world came together, and it seems to be, as I say, falling apart again.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. It came together, and I think, you know, I mean, I wasn't conscious of it, you know, at the time, but you know, I know that there was a sort of concerted effort to try to make it a human thing, not an American thing. Even though there was definitely a U.S. component that could rightly be very proud of you know, doing something that everybody thought was impossible, but it wasn't just about that. It was both. It was. And you hear it if you in the interviews from people back at the time who all said, you know, felt like we did it. We all participated in this, and I think you know, NASA, you know, was happy with that message was being delivered. I mean, the biggest thing I think that the legacy of the space program that I see is just the inspiration that it provides. You know, to people, you know, all over the world, especially kids. But you know, I can't tell you the number of times that people have come to me and said, you know, I'm doing what I'm doing, which oftentimes is very significant in its own right, although not necessarily space related. But I was inspired to make my career choice because of, you know, what the Apollo program represented to me. And I think that the value of that is, you know, is incalculable. You know, and I think, you know, we probably lost some of that, you know, after the Apollo program wound down. But I feel like it's coming back. You know, I think there's sort of a groundswell of interest, and there's still, I mean, kids are inherently wired, I think, to be interested in space, and you just have to facilitate that interest. You know, I have some friends that are teachers, and they tend to messaged me to let me know that they just did their space week or whatever, right? And I always sort of ask them, well, how many kids were paying attention? And the answer is always pretty much all of them. And so I think that's very encouraging. And you know, as the space presence continues to increase, I mean, we've got, you know, Americans going back up into space next week, hopefully, for the first time in a while, and a lot of plans are being made and to work further in space, and I think that will all feed on itself to continue that momentum. That's what I hope for.
I mean, I'm also taken by having been at a Marillion weekend a few years ago, Steve, by the fact that, you know, you finished at the end with flags all the way across the back, right? I mean, there's a real sense of international family about that as well. I mean, so music and space, they do have that. I mean, I don't think, you know, well, maybe music has divided in the past as well. It's not always a unifier. After all, music can be used to symbolize nationalism and patriotism as well. But do you see music as something which is inherently about being human, but also understanding other people's experiences and bringing people together in that sense?
I think so, especially in the case of this band. People relate to Steve Hogarth's lyrics and to Fisher's lyrics before that, and you know, the music takes them on a journey, and you tend to find that when all those people from all over the world come together, it just creates an incredible sense of community and a passion and energy for music. You know, as you experienced at the Marillion weekends, it's unlike anything else on Earth. So it is, yeah, very much a unifying experience, probably in the same way as anyone that's gone to a launch, or shuttle launch, or an Apollo launch, or anything like that. You know, just that shared experience is something very special that stays with you, I think.
Yeah, I can very much subscribe, Steve, to what you just said. I mean, it's a medium to convey moods, to convey feelings, and to express things that you probably cannot express in a different way. I mean, not everyone is a philosopher, but a way to express things. And in exactly that sense, I fully concur to what you have said. It is something that helps to unify. I mean, not only while having been in space, but music is something that is also linked to all times of our life. We have memories of certain parts of our life when we were teenagers and all that. And for me, this is always linked to a certain type of music and songs I like, and then you meet people who you have never seen before, and you find out, hey, this person likes exactly the same song, and you have immediately a link. Huh? So it's really something very universal.
Definitely.
You know, and you know, I think this touches on something I think, you know, so important. You know, just that both music and the feeling of shared endeavor involved in space exploration, they do really bring people together. And I guess, you know, Thomas, we've spoken so much about your experience, you know, in orbit. You know, I mean, you've continued your work in the field of space exploration. I mean, you are the Interagency Coordinator and Advisor to the Director General at the European Space Agency. So I wondered perhaps what you might tell us, just something that I think Rick so importantly touched on. There are exciting developments and there are things to be excited about. What does the future hold for us, both immediate and long-term from your perspective?
Wow, Alex, that's a good question. I try to condense it. I mean, first of all, and Rick has been just talking about this experience of the first moon landing of your father, Rick, and I was 11 years following this moment on the TV screen, and I still get goosebumps today when I think about it. Huh? And if I imagine that I could stand with my own feet on the surface of another celestial body, it's still exciting for me, and I'm pretty sure we will witness that. If it really works in 2024, let's see, but it will happen in this decade. I have no doubt about it. Now, we always said that space exploration is really an international endeavor. And I still deeply believe that this is true. However, you know, at the moment, there are technical developments which are clearly pointing to return of humans to the moon. But there are also developments where one can get a little bit doubt if this is really this kind of international endeavor that we have been thinking about it. So at the end, it's our task to help to come to this kind of collaboration. And there might be intermediate steps where not everyone is on board, but where already many people are on board. So what are the near-term developments? You might be aware that Europe is making quite an important contribution to the whole infrastructure, the service module that will bring the US Orion capsule then to the moon. Is provided by the European Space Agency, and of course we are very proud of that. And that is probably a contribution which also will lead to a moment sometimes later in this decade when one of my colleagues, a female or male European astronaut, will also be on the surface of the moon. And I tell you, I'm really looking forward to that, to witness that, and to sit in front of the TV or wherever that I will be able to follow it, in order to just see this moment happening. The big difference as compared to Apollo is, of course, Apollo was a program, just as we all know, and Alex, you have mentioned it, it was taken place in a time of the East-West conflict, a competition. And after Apollo 17, it just stopped. Now, the next time that humans will get off the moon, I'm pretty sure it will be on a more sustainable approach. And that will be supported by an infrastructure which is called the Lunar Gateway. So it's an intermediate station that will be set up orbiting the moon. And so future astronauts then will first go to this lunar orbital gateway, and then from there to the surface. And then when coming back, they make a quick stop in this gateway before returning to Earth. That will help to build up really a more sustainable infrastructure on the surface of the moon. You might have heard that the south pole of the moon is very interesting, because there we know there is quite some resources, especially water, which is extremely precious for drinking, for generating oxygen. So having oxygen to breathe, for rocket fuel. And all these systems that then are converting the water, that are electrolyzing it, they need to be built in a way that they are really reliable, that if something breaks, it can be easily repaired. You know, something that we do on the space station also. I mean, every once in a while, onboard systems fail, they have to be repaired. But there you are much further away from the Earth, so you are more autonomous, and you need really to be sure that you can handle that. And all of this is, I think, then the important prerequisite to send humans to our neighboring planet Mars. And Mark, I don't know if you have already talked about it, but of course our neighboring planet is a very, very interesting place, because here it's likely that the question if there has been or maybe still is life can be answered. And I think we all keep our fingers crossed that we will find evidence that either life has existed or is still existing in form of, who knows, little microbes. And this is a very, very interesting place. And I think with all these prerequisites or these steps I have been talking about, that will build up then to a human mission to our neighboring planet Mars in the next decade, probably. Technically, it would be feasible. And of course, the hope is to come back and close the circle to this international character of exploration, that this will be really done in a true international cooperation with as many nations that are on it. And maybe as a last word, the ISS is really a good example there for this cooperation, because more than 100 countries are participating in the research there. So apart from all the science, I think this is really a remarkable aspect. There are more than 100 countries who are pursuing common goals for the benefit of everyone.
Very well said. And, you know, I have to say, Thomas, you know, we're talking about such lofty aspirations. And, you know, I do sometimes wonder, it's just a thought for the group really, whether given our current situation, you know, just with the pandemic and so on, whether there is something to learn from that spirit of cooperation, you know, because this is certainly a situation that we face not as nationalities, but as a species.
Yes, yes, definitely true.
So, you know, I wondered if I mean, we've talked a little bit about, you know, the future now, of course, but also, you know, the past as well. And it's a bit of a left turn, but also just a little bit of trivia, you know, as well. Because of course, I mean, Thomas, you brought recorded music up into space, you know, and well, Steve, you and I were talking about a pretty unique experience that you had with another astronaut, Charlie Duke. You know, who brought you know, his own little tape machine up there as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we met courtesy of a holiday in the Maldives with Rick. We actually met Charlie. I had dinner with him on my 60th birthday, and was it the next day?
That was not an accident.
Yeah, Rick arranged that.
Yes.
Him. Yeah. How good could your 60th birthday be? No better than that, I can tell you. But anyway, yeah, Charlie was telling me about how they could each make a cassette of music to take to the moon, and he had a friend who was a country DJ who basically got all the country stars of the time to record a session for Charlie to listen to on the way to and from the moon, which was pretty cool. But anyway, the couple of days after, or a day after we had dinner with Charlie, we actually played for him. We're in another one of the cottages, and Rick was playing acoustic guitar, I was playing acoustic guitar. Mark, Rick's brother, was singing, and we played Rocket Man for Charlie Duke, which is, I mean, yeah, how much better does life get, really?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, one of my favorite songs, in fact, but there is one phrase which we need to find out, and I'm sure you all know the phrase, Mars ain't a place to raise your cats. In fact, it's cold as hell, so let's see.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Well, a completely unique experience, but I guess that it's just a great example of just the ties, you know, that exist culturally to space exploration. It isn't just about what we discover, but it's what we bring back, and you know, the experiences that enrich all of us, you know, because it does feel like something that we achieve, you know, as a species, and I guess that's the most, you know, important thing. And so I have to ask, you know, I mean, Rick, I mean, did your dad approve of you playing guitar and all your records as a kid?
When the first thing I started learning, a friend of mine had played bass, and he got a new bass, and so he just gave me his old one, and that was kind of the first thing I started playing. And for whatever reason, the band that I started learning bass to was Black Sabbath. And I know that my mom and dad were, you know, could hear this and were down thinking, what has happened to our son? You know, but they never said anything about it. Yeah, you know, my dad, he wasn't a rock music fan in general. He was more of a, you know, big band era kind of guy, but you know, he definitely understood the value of music. So he, while he might not have personally enjoyed some of the stuff I subjected him to, then he didn't oppose it. So the other thing that was always funny, I remember, you know, my mom had the best description of Yes, because I was a big Yes fan then, and at one point she goes, I don't like them. They're too busy.
It reminds me of that wonderful line from Amadeus, where whichever king or prince it is turns to Mozart and said, "Too many notes, Mr. Mozart. Too many notes." I'm a Yes fan too. Yes, absolutely. Lots of whittling. Yes, that's true.
So Rick, when was it when your dad came along and you the Marillion sound check and you and Mark?
Oh, right. Yeah, we did the. So Marillion had started at the convention. They started this thing called Swap the Band, where you could submit a tape, and if you got chosen, you got to play up on stage in place of whoever you did that for, or whose ever instrument you played. And so I actually got picked to do it the very first Marillion weekend, which was a very nerve-wracking experience. But I have a niece that is a just really phenomenal singer, and we were trying to get her to audition to consider doing this, because I think she would have done good, or done well. So this was the Marbles tour, right? So Marillion came through Cincinnati on the Marbles tour, and the next convention was going to be in the spring. So we got Kaylee to whose name was Kaylee, by the way, which was partially inspired by the song, as I'm sure so many others were. Got her to come sing, and she had big time knee surgery and was in a cast, and so she hobbled up on crutches on the stage. And so this was at the sound check before the gig, and so my dad came to watch that, and she passed the audition, right? I mean, she's this little thing, but I think she had a big voice, and the song she did, "There Was No One Can," and when it got to the chorus, I think I even saw H kind of like give her a little side eye, like, "Oh, I didn't expect that." Didn't expect that voice coming out of her. But yeah, that was great. But yeah, Dad came up, and he, we did some group pictures and stuff, and it was there's a few stories of him with encounters with musicians that I know he was secretly going, "I'm not sure what's going on here," but he didn't say anything.
I'm sort of motivated. That immediately, took me back. I think we talked about this earlier when you came to Tech. I went on tour. I did some talks with Buzz Aldrin a few years ago, and every time you're in the presence of somebody who's probably met such a vast array of people, and of course your father was exactly the same. I mean, but you also realize that pretty much in every occasion, your father was the most important person in the room. It didn't really matter if it was a president. Presidents come, presidents go. Kings and queens. That must sort of yield a perspective. And I think your father was famous for not sort of taking too much out of that.
Right? He wouldn't see it that way.
It
would never occur to him to be anything but just a normal guy. And I think it's just how he wanted to try and be. So
but you're at that kind of crazy one remove, right, of your father having met such a vast array of historical figures. I mean, did you travel with him at times and have that opportunity? Does that stick with you, some of the people that you met through him?
So I mean, there were some. I mean, he didn't. He went on a lot of trips that it was much more likely for me not to be there than it was. But yeah, we had, I can remember coming home from school, and in the living room, Edmund Hillary was there. And like, oh, that's my, I knew who he was. I was old enough to know who he was. Oh, very nice to meet. I don't know why he was there, but they ended up actually doing something later on. I think they went to the North Pole together, if I remember right. But yeah, stuff would just happen out of the blue. I think you just kind of get used to it. It doesn't seem, it's just kind of normal. And that's the best way I can describe it. don't really get surprised by much of anything that happens.
Amazing. Well, I guess we've not just got this future Prog supergroup, on this Zoom call here, which I think we need to discuss immediately afterward. But we also have a really, really great audience watching us today. And from what I gather, literally from all over the world. And so, before we go, I want to bring in a few questions from the people who so kindly, joined in. And the thing is Thomas is kind of cheating on this one because he's actually been into space, but I suppose he can probably kind of make the most informed kind of answer to all of this. And well, this one comes from Leslie, and it's a question about what track would you want to play were you aboard the International Space Station? What do you think the most fitting track would be? She says that her track would be Lucilla, of course, and I think it's a fantastic choice. But what track would you choose to play while you're taking in that vista? Thomas, I suppose you got to start us off here.
Oh, it's not easy to make a choice there because of all these different moods and views you see. But I mentioned already this song from Fleetwood Mac, Albatross, is a beautiful track. I heard from Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here, or to go a little bit into classic, Gustav Holst, The Planets, and this one song which is about Jupiter that would fit extremely well when you are just cruising over the oceans and over the continents.
Well, fantastic choices, all of them, of course, and properly bombastic. How about yourself, Mark? What would you choose yourself?
The thing that came to mind, I think it was probably through Rick triggering, me thinking about Yes. I would probably pick the song Awaken from Going for the One, if only because there's a absolutely stunning key change in the second half. It's a long piece, but I'd want to sort of liaise with ground, mission control, and make sure that key change happened exactly at the moment of sunrise. Just as it came through the window, because it's sunrise on the space station is very sudden. You go around the Earth in just 90 minutes. So, you see these videos, it just happens. It's not a long drawn out process. And so I think picking a piece of music like that that's kind of got that, that feeling of emergence, timing. And of course we could all pick a piece that would go with sunset as well. There'll be a dark moment in a piece of music, but Awaken from Yes, and time to fit with sunrise.
Very good, very Prog. Fantastic. How about yourself, Rick?
That's a tough call. I mean, the very first thing that came to mind was Echoes from Pink Floyd. But whatever song it would have to be a long song. So I was sort of racking my brain trying to go think through all the long songs that I know.
You're a Prog fan, Rick. You don't know anything that's not a long song. Come on.
Particularly long. Close to the Edge.
There you go.
I think maybe would have to be on the short list of the ones that I'm going to choose. Carnival 9. Maybe the Second Impression for I don't know. It'd be a fun decision to have to make, wouldn't it? If I had that. Yeah.
Well, Echoes is certainly very good. And yourself, Steve?
Another Pink Floyd track. It would have to be Shine On You Crazy Diamond for me.
Powerful as it gets, certainly. And I guess I suppose I guess Gilmour does know his way around a guitar, certainly. And
yeah, he's pretty damn good.
Yeah. and I think I had to agree with Leslie. I think that Lucilla would be a fantastic candidate as well, which is certainly an exciting portent of the music that we can await just a little later this year. I've got another question. I suppose it was kind of answered a little bit, but for Thomas, what are the acoustics like in space vehicles from Jeff Smith? You were talking about this a little bit before. But it sounds like a bit of a challenge, not the ideal studio scenario.
That's indeed true. Usually what is very prevailing is this sound of ventilation, you know, that everyone knows, for example, from airplanes. It's just a little bit louder because in addition to this hissing noise of ventilation, you have, for example, on board the station, there are hundreds of ventilators running in order to circulate the air. There are pumps running to circulate the cooling fluid. And that makes it pretty noisy. It's 72 decibel in most spots. So when you are, for example, having breakfast, lunch, or dinner together, and you're hovering around this this table, you really need to talk to each other with a loud voice in order to have a good communication. And that's why I said, in order to find a spot where it's a little bit more quiet, usually we are going to the airlocks. There are no ventilators. There are ventilation hoses which ensure that the air is circulated, but you don't have this strong background noise. And the same is in the capsule, by the way. There also you have always this ventilation noise. And by the way, also when you are doing extravehicular activity, we all know in space, in the vacuum of space, sound waves cannot propagate. But inside the spacesuit, you still hear this hissing noise of the life support systems, and you want to hear it, I can tell you.
You know, for a second, I thought you were going to take the line from a very popular thing, which is, in space, no one can hear you solo, right?
I'm just curious, Thomas, then why... I'm not sure I've ever seen astronauts wearing noise-canceling headphones, for example, or even in-ear monitors, which, I mean, I've got these on which block an awful lot of sound just passively. Are there noise-canceling headphones on board? I mean, it would get rid of a lot of that rumble, you would have thought.
Yes, yes. There are noise-canceling headphones on orbit, and we use them occasionally. If I had really be strongly focused on, you know, whatever kind of work I had to do. I mean, not like maintenance work. There you are just unmounting devices, exchanging them. But there are some scientific experiments where you need to be very careful about the numbers and in which sequence to do all the commands that you have to give. In those cases, I tend to wear a noise cancelling headphone. And by the way, during the night, I usually put earplugs in my ears. You still can hear sufficiently enough if an alarm goes off, but at least you don't have this high-pitched noise. And that is, by the way, also a problem if you are staying for a long time without hearing protection. It reflects in your audiogram after you return. You can see some dents there. Yeah.
Well, you know, I've got to ask myself, Thomas, you were touching on it before, certainly, but, you know, donning a spacesuit, what is going through your mind when you, I guess you don't step over the threshold from the airlock into outer space, but certainly you float there. I mean, what is the experience of that like? Because I can't imagine anything more thrilling, more terrifying, and more indescribable than being untethered in that way.
Well, Alex, not terrifying so much, but it is definitely thrilling. Of course, in preparation during your training, you are doing every little step over and over again in these big basins where you have to train really for each activity that you are going to carry out when you then are in space and doing this extravehicular activity. So you are familiar with this environment, being inside such a spacesuit, doing all the operation to lower the pressure in the airlock. But then the famous or the really thrilling moment comes when you are going to open the hatch. And I can tell you on my first extravehicular activity, which I did on the Russian space station here, I was with my Russian colleague, Sergei Avdeyev. He was operating the valves. I was reading the procedure. So you are checking all systems of the suit, lowering the pressure. At certain pressure level, you have to stop to see if your suit is really functioning properly. And then you really open the valve last time and pressure drops. So there are some interesting effects. Of course, we know in the air it has moisture, and this condenses on the circumference of the EVA hatch. And I could see this condensate there, and all of a sudden, you know, when the pressure was going below a certain level, you could see how this condensate was starting to boil. You know, the boiling point is a function of the pressure. So you saw these water droplets, and they started to boil, and then from one second to the next, they became ice, and they break off, and then little ice crystals were floating around. And that is when the pressure is almost close to zero. And then I unlock the hatch so that the residual air molecules in the airlock can leave the airlock, and you unlock it the second time. There is still some force, so you have to hold it firmly, otherwise it just wanks open. And with this residual air molecules, these ice crystals were floating out of the hatch. And you usually open the hatch when you're still on the night side. So my view was in this starry sky. You see the stars, and then you see these little ice crystals floating away and merging with this starry sky behind. And it's, you know, it's a picture where you forget to breathe because it's so unreal, and you think this must be a fairy tale, that must be a dream. It's so beautiful. And of course, then you hear ground control saying, "Okay, guys, are you already outside?" No, not yet. You're just amazed by this beautiful view. And then I went outside. There is like a little ladder on the Mir station. You go out, you connect your tethers that you are firmly connected. You turn around, and then the next exciting moment comes, because you see, I would say for the first time, the station with your own eyes from the outside. Of course, you have been living inside for weeks, for months, but then all of a sudden you see it from the outside and in front of the horizon with the sunrise. And that is another moment where you would like to just stay a couple of minutes and inhale this view, but unfortunately they don't send you out to enjoy the view, but to do work. And ground control is always pushing and take the equipment out, and then you need to go on with your work. And EVA is usually 6 hours, so in the 6 hours you really have a full program, and then you are just functioning. And if you have a few seconds between some of the activities you have to do outside, and you can turn around, just turn your back to this station, which is your home in this environment, and you only can see below, in front, above you. I mean, up and down doesn't play a role when you are in space. But if you see then the continents passing by, and imagine that you are 400 kilometers above and cruising along with almost 28,000 kilometers per hour, it's hard to comprehend, but it happens. And you always think, is that just a dream, or do you really do it? But of course, then you focus again on your work. You try to absorb as much of this experience as you can. And you know, once you are back in the station after an EVA, it takes time to just process all these experiences and these feelings that you have that you had the chance to acquire there.
Absolutely. Please.
I work for Reiter. I mean, I'm in the space business, but I mean, just listening to that sort of poetic description of something, it took me there. But it also made me think, you know, as a young kid, Rick, you must have, I hope at least, your dad told you a similar story about it, what it was like. I mean, that sense of human connection, which I just got from listening to Thomas. There must have been a point in your life where your dad just sort of sat you down and said, "This is how it was, son." I mean, I'm just sort of awed by that idea. Did that happen? I mean, again, I don't want to put you on the spot.
You know, actually, you know, he got asked about it so much by people that as kids, we didn't want to felt like we didn't want to add to the noise, right? but every now and then, I can remember talking to him about the lunar descent, and the low fuel problem, and what was really going on there, and he said, well, the fact of the matter is that we really didn't know exactly how much fuel we had. The countdown times were not to tank empty, but were to a mandatory abort call. But the construction of the tank was such that with fuel slosh and so forth, you never had, you never knew exactly what it was like. But I think it was Gene Cernan who had said, that it's like in your car when it shows on empty, you still got another gallon in there. So you're not too worried about it. So yeah, so now and then
we've all been there, right? It's like, come on,
exactly.
At least another gallon.
I do remember, that when he got back, we had some sort of Q&A session. I don't really remember much I couldn't tell you what he said then. But yeah, now and then we talk about it. But he got asked about it so much that he didn't felt a little guilty if he asked them about it for without a reason to ask. But if you wanted to get him to talk, you just ask him about airplane, and then he was, you couldn't shut him up. He'd just go on. You want to ask him, talk about the X-15 or pick any plane, it wouldn't matter. I remember I went to Oshkosh Air Show with him once, where they have more than 10,000 planes there, and it was the 2003 show, so I think that was the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers flight, and he had given a talk the night before. But the next day we got to just walk around the field and look at planes, and it was any plane that I pointed to, and in Oshkosh, a lot of those are experimental home built types of planes. It's not just fighters and so forth, but there was not a plane that I could point to that he would be able to recite chapter and verse about what that plane was about. I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure I could have done better if I would have had, an iPad with Google looking up what's that plane. He was the equivalent. It was, and I don't know how he kept up with that. It was really one of those moments I'll never forget.
I just love that idea, Neil Armstrong, lifelong pilot, part-time astronaut, right? I mean, it's that kind of.
and he could walk around. Nobody really recognized him. Just had a hat on and just could wander around, and there was no hordes of people or anything. It was just, a lot of times he would be fine in public, not to be recognized until somebody did. And then as soon as somebody did, then other people they would make a connection. But as long as that never happened, it was fine. And so yeah, he just, I remember saying that my particularly favorite plane was the F4, the Phantom. When I was a kid, that was the model that I took the most time, on trying to do it properly. And I pointed out, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I was one of the test pilots on that." I'm like, I didn't know that until that point.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, we're coming up to the end now, and we're going to loop back to the world of prog music. Whatever the medium. We've had a fantastic question. I think it's a wonderful one to end it on, and it's a subject that's come up a few times, and I think it brings all of these things together. Human possibility, the future of humans in space, and also a little elements of sci-fi. I'm sure we've all heard something about the concept of generation ships, and I think this is a great one, because the idea is that you have a spaceship which contains multiple generations of humans. In order to get to the next star, the next solar system, you have to have many generations to survive. And I suppose what's great about it is you can't take everything with you. You have to be careful about what to pack. So if you're packing for a generation ship, knowing that future generations would inherit your possessions, what record would you make sure was in their collection? It's a tough one. Take a moment. You know, future generations of humanity, they will land perhaps on another planet. Mark, how about you?
Thank you, Alex. That's very kind. Everybody else was counting on somebody else being asked first, so they had a couple of minutes to think about it. You know, weirdly enough, I mean, I don't know why. Again, it's a bit like Rick earlier on. These things sort of flash into your mind, and then because there's a million records, right? I mean, you couldn't do with one. It's not possible, right? Even doing desert island discs with 10 or so, it's crazy. It's just not possible. But the first thing that popped into my mind, I think probably because I saw a documentary recently about how revolutionary it was at the time, and I wasn't, you know, I was pretty young, so it wasn't on my radar screen till much later on. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, just the way that in some ways through the musical techniques, you could, it's not maybe the first, but it's almost a pivotal prog album in some ways, the way that it was put together and the way that the Beatles sort of went from who they were, pop stars, into being musical explorers. So there you go. I mean, it's just the first thing that came to mind. I'm not even sure I own it, but yes, that would be, that has to be sent.
I think staying with the Pink Floyd theme, I think mine would be Dark Side of the Moon.
Very good answer. I mean, an album that I don't think you can go back to enough times. No. There's always something new there, which is a pretty mind-blowing thing, certainly. How about yourself, Rick?
Well, the first thing that popped into my head would actually have been not prog rock, but Rachmaninoff Symphony No. 2. I'm just thinking of something that I wanted some other civilization to hear. You know, that's got, it's got the emotion, it's got the darkness, it's got the light. It's, I don't know. If I thought about it some more, I'd probably come up with a different answer, but that was the first thing that came to me.
That's a good one.
No, it's up to me. So
no pressure.
No, I had a little bit of time to think. Okay, so Pink Floyd is on, we have the Beatles on, we have quite a good choice. So now I can adapt my choice to what is already on the spaceship. And I think I would choose a record from Michael Hedges.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Very good answer. Very good answer.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a pretty healthy record collection to me, certainly, and I got to say, a nice one to certainly end this wonderful conversation on. Now, we have a tradition on Space Rocks Uplink, which Mark is always the instigator, and before we go, we got to ask everybody to join us in doing a bit of this.
Yeah.
And,
so of course, the Vulcan salute is for space. And then rocks is for space rocks. So see if we can get both of those together on the screen. Come on, Thomas, you need the rocks as well. There you go. Thank you very much, gents. A real pleasure today. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great to see you all. All the best.
Yeah, cheers, Thomas. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.